That's my ex-wife. The words hung heavy in the air, slicing through the ambient hum of the luxury restaurant. Moments earlier, everything was perfect. Leonard Whitmore, a millionaire CEO, sat across from his new girlfriend Isabel, enjoying their very first date. But everything shifted when a stunning pregnant black woman stepped through the door. Her presence shattered his composure and drew a quiet storm into Isabel's curious gaze. "Who is she?" she had asked innocently. And now with one confession, the polished image Leonard had built was crumbling. But who is this woman? And why did Leonard leave her years ago when he had nothing, only to be haunted by her now, just as he seemingly has everything? Welcome to a story of love, loss, and second chances. Before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? What do you think is going to happen next? Make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the full journey ahead. "That's my ex-wife," Leonard said, and the world seemed to shift with those four words. The words left his lips slowly, almost reluctantly, like a man confessing to a crime he had tried to forget. Across the table, Isabel's wine glass froze halfway to her lips, her blue eyes narrowing with the kind of curiosity that was polite on the surface but razor-sharp underneath. A piano played softly in the background. Waiters glided between candlelit tables, and outside the glass walls of the upscale restaurant, the city pulsed like a living thing, unaware that within these four walls, a life was quietly unraveling. The evening had begun with elegance. Leonard, ever composed in his tailored charcoal suit, had reserved the best corner table in the house, a semi-private alcove nestled beneath warm golden lights, offering a view of the skyline and just enough seclusion to whisper secrets. Isabel, radiant in a pale silk dress that matched the champagne shimmer of her earrings, had arrived precisely at 7, smiling with the practiced poise of a woman accustomed to being admired. Their conversation had flowed easily. Art, architecture, philanthropy, subtle flirtation, until the door opened and she walked in. Leonard hadn't noticed her at first, not really. There had been a flicker, a shift in the air, the way a room changes when someone important enters, even if no one knows why. But when he turned to glance casually toward the entrance, the fork in his hand froze midair. His stomach tightened as though the air had been knocked from his chest. She stood there, framed by the restaurant's golden entrance like a vision conjured from memory, her hand resting gently on the curve of her belly, her skin glowing with that unmistakable radiance of pregnancy. Her hair was styled in soft coils that he didn't recognize, but everything else, the grace, the fire in her eyes, the quiet strength in the way she carried herself, was undeniably Lulama. He tried to breathe, to look away, but his eyes refused to obey. 5 years had passed since he'd last seen her. 5 years since he'd left her standing in a half-furnished apartment with nothing but unpaid bills and a whispered apology. He'd told himself then that it was for her sake, that walking away was mercy, not cowardice, that she deserved better than a man scraping together startup capital and pride. He had convinced himself that letting her go was noble, but now with just a glance, that narrative collapsed like a house of cards in a gust of reality. "Leonard," Isabel said again, more slowly this time, her voice dipped in warning. "Who is she?" She had turned slightly in her seat and was now watching Lulama being led to a table across the room. The hostess pulled out her chair as Lulama settled into place, her pregnancy obvious but her composure untouched. Leonard swallowed hard, the weight of the past rising like a tide in his throat. His first instinct was to lie, to say she looked familiar, maybe an old college classmate. But the words that escaped were true. "That's my ex-wife." Isabel raised an eyebrow, her voice calm but laced with quiet disbelief. "Your ex-wife? You've never mentioned being married before?" Leonard stared at his untouched plate, his appetite gone. "It was a different life," he said, though the excuse felt like ash in his mouth. "Before everything took off, before the company, before any of this." She studied him for a moment, not accusing, not quite angry, but calculating. "She's pregnant," Isabel observed, her gaze returning to Lulama. "Is it yours?" Leonard exhaled, perhaps a little too sharply. "No, we haven't spoken in years." But even as he said it, doubt crept in like a whisper. He didn't know who the father was. He didn't know anything about Lulama's life now. what art she curated, where she lived, what books sat on her nightstand, or what song she hummed when no one was listening. He only knew that seeing her had hit him like a freight train. Isabel continued watching him as if waiting for something, an admission, a breakdown, a truth he didn't yet know how to articulate. "So," she said, her tone lighter but her eyes sharp. "What now?" Leonard had no answer. He looked at Lulama again, across a sea of candlelit tables and quiet conversations, and found that she hadn't noticed him. Or if she had, she gave no indication. She looked calm, self-possessed, even peaceful. That alone stung more than any confrontation might have. Because if she had seen him and simply chosen not to react, that meant she had moved on. Truly. She didn't need his explanation, his apology, his presence. She had built a new life without him, and now it included a child he knew nothing about. Isabel reached across the table and touched his hand. "Leonard," she said gently, "are you still in love with her?" It wasn't a trap. It wasn't even judgment. It was a question, and he had no idea how to answer it, because the truth was more complicated than yes or no. The truth lived in the quiet ache in his chest, in the memories rushing back faster than he could push them away, in the vision of a life he once had and let go, all in the name of progress, of success, of fear disguised as sacrifice. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the glass like stars in a restless sky. Inside, Leonard sat in silence, unsure whether he was a man staring into the past or the edge of something new. He looked again toward the woman he had once promised forever, and felt the weight of every broken vow between them. And as the waiter returned with their entrees, the aroma rising like something distant and unreachable, he realized that dinner would not be the only thing left untouched tonight. The silence between them had weight, dense and uncomfortable, like a fog settling over the table and muting everything that had once felt effortless just moments before. Leonard stared at his plate, the salmon growing cold beneath the flickering candlelight, and Isabel, still poised, still beautiful, watched him with an expression that was no longer amused or intrigued, but quietly analytical, like a woman trying to decipher a puzzle she hadn't agreed to play. The low murmur of nearby conversations, the clink of glass, the occasional laughter from another table, all of it seemed distant, like background noise to a private storm neither of them had expected when the evening began. Isabel was the first to break the silence, her voice low and deliberate. "I didn't know you were married," she said, not accusing, but coolly matter-of-fact. Leonard forced himself to meet her eyes, even though the weight of her gaze made him feel like a boy caught in a lie he had long buried. "It was a long time ago," he replied, the words sounding thinner than he intended. "Before the company took off, before the boardrooms and the press and the penthouse, back when I was still trying to make rent." She tilted her head, brushing a lock of blonde hair behind one ear as she studied him. "And you just never thought to mention it?" Leonard took a sip of water he didn't need, hoping it might clear the dryness in his throat. "I guess I thought it didn't matter anymore, that it was part of a life I left behind." He paused, the bitterness of the truth catching in his voice. "But seeing her again tonight, I realized I've been lying to myself about that." Isabel didn't blink. She just kept her eyes on him, steady and unsettling in their silence. "You said she was your ex-wife," she continued, her voice as composed as ever, but this time with an edge, a subtle fracture in the cool exterior. "And now she's pregnant, with someone else's child, I assume?" Leonard nodded once, not trusting his voice. "You assume," Isabel repeated softly, more to herself than to him. "You don't know for sure." It wasn't a question. It was an observation laced with something sharper than curiosity. "No," he admitted. "I don't. We haven't spoken in years." And yet the image of Lulama, glowing under the restaurant lights, resting a protective hand on her belly with the same grace she once had when she held his dreams, refused to leave his mind. Isabel's lips pressed into a line, her fingers absently tracing the stem of her wineglass. "You look like you'd seen a ghost," she said finally. "Like the ground had opened under your feet. I've never seen you like that." Leonard leaned back in his chair, his shoulders tight, his entire body fighting the urge to retreat into silence. But Isabel deserved better than silence. She had always been direct with him, sharp when necessary, but never cruel. And now, facing the mess of his carefully curated past, he owed her that same clarity. When I met her, he began, I had nothing, not even the illusion of having something. We were broke, living in a one-bedroom apartment with a heater that barely worked and a fridge that made more noise than it kept food cold. But she believed in me, in the dream, in everything I thought I wanted to build. Isabel said nothing, so he kept going, the words rising as if they had been waiting years to be spoken. And then things got hard, hard. I started pushing her away, telling myself she deserved better than to be dragged through my failure, that letting her go was an act of love. He laughed softly, but there was no joy in it. That's how I justified it anyway. I told myself I was setting her free. The truth is, I was scared. Scared of failing with her watching, scared of being seen as weak. Isabel finally moved, shifting slightly in her seat, her hands folding in front of her as she spoke. So you disappeared. He nodded slowly. Divorced her, packed everything into a box, changed numbers, moved into a borrowed office space, and buried myself in work until the company finally hit traction. The air between them grew heavier, not from anger, but from understanding, the kind that cuts more than confrontation. Isabel exhaled slowly. And you never reached out again? Leonard's jaw clenched. I couldn't. Every time I thought about it, I felt like I'd forfeited the right. She deserved peace, not a man who abandoned her, trying to resurface out of guilt. They both fell quiet again, the noise of the restaurant returning around them like water filling the vacuum left behind. A waiter approached with the check, unsure whether to disturb them, but Leonard waved him away without looking. Isabel's voice was softer now, almost tired. Do you still love her? Leonard didn't answer immediately because he didn't know what the truth was, or perhaps he didn't yet dare to say it out loud. He looked at Isabel, not the woman who had caused the storm, but the one sitting across from him now, caught in its wake through no fault of her own. I think I've never really stopped, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Not because I want to go back, not out of nostalgia, but because I don't think I ever dealt with what I left behind. I thought building this empire would fill that void, that the next milestone would silence the guilt. But it never did. Isabel sat very still. She didn't reach for her glass again. She didn't look away. But there was something in her posture, some delicate shift, that told him she was already creating distance, already beginning to wrap herself in the armor of someone who saw the ending before the words were said. Leonard, she said quietly, I appreciate your honesty. I do, but I don't think I'm the person you should be having this conversation with right now. He nodded, a dull ache blooming behind his eyes. I know. She stood slowly, gathering her clutch and her dignity in one fluid motion. Take care of yourself, she said, then paused, her eyes lingering on him a moment longer. And maybe, if you get the chance, tell her everything you just told me, before it's too late. Then she walked away, leaving Leonard alone at the table with the untouched meal, the weight of 5 lost years, and the quiet hum of a future that had just changed direction again. The gallery didn't look like much from the outside. It was tucked between a reclaimed warehouse and a coffee shop with mismatched chairs out front. The kind of place Leonard would have walked past without a second glance in the days when his mind was filled with market reports and investor meetings. But today, as he stepped out of his sleek black car and onto the uneven sidewalk, the building seemed to radiate a quiet gravity. The painted mural above the door, a cascade of earthy tones and maternal imagery, caught his eye and held it, its warmth oddly disarming. He wasn't here by accident. He had searched for her deliberately, typed her name into search bars like a guilty man dialing a number he shouldn't call. And now he stood at the edge of a place where her world still moved, hoping for something he couldn't name. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paint and wood polish. Sunlight poured through high industrial windows, catching the polished concrete floor in soft slants. The walls were lined with art, vivid, textured, layered works that spoke of stories rarely heard in the polished boardrooms Leonard frequented. Women of color in traditional dress, abstract renderings of childbirth and motherhood, woven tapestries that felt like memory. He took it all in slowly, hands in pockets, unsure if he was here for the art or for the woman behind it. Either way, his heart thudded with the tense, uneven rhythm of confrontation and hope. He didn't see her at first. Perhaps he had expected her to appear instantly, drawn to his presence like fate had arranged a perfectly timed reveal. But Lulama wasn't a fantasy, and this wasn't a movie. This was real life, raw and unfiltered. He wandered through the exhibit, pausing before a photograph of a pregnant woman standing knee-deep in river water, arms raised, her face tilted toward the sky. There was power in that image, primal, unashamed, free. He stared at it longer than he realized until a voice, calm and steady, sliced cleanly through the stillness. "I didn't expect to see you here." The words were simple, but Leonard turned like they were thunder. And there she was. Lulama stood a few feet away, arms folded gently over the swell of her belly, wearing a black wrap dress that clung to her with effortless elegance. Her hair was braided back this time, and her eyes, those eyes he used to know better than his own reflection, were watchful but not cold. If she was surprised, she didn't show it. If seeing him stirred anything at all, she held it beneath the surface like still water concealing a current. Leonard, suddenly aware of the inadequacy of every prepared line he'd rehearsed in his car, managed only a breath. "Lulama." She gave a small nod, measured and professional. "Are you here for the exhibit, or is this a coincidence?" Leonard could have lied, could have said he was passing through, curious, pulled in by the art. But this place, her place, demanded honesty. It was built on it. "I saw you the other night," he said, "at the restaurant. I didn't know how to say anything then, but I had to see if you were okay." Her smile came slowly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm more than okay, Leonard, but thank you for your concern." A beat passed. A visitor wandered past them, murmuring admiration for a nearby oil painting. Lulama's eyes briefly followed them, then returned to him. "I'm working, as you can see. The gallery closes in 20 minutes. Leonard felt the ground shift beneath him, not because she was unkind, but because she was controlled. This was not the woman he'd left, vulnerable and stunned on a cold apartment floor. This was someone who had rebuilt, who had weathered storms and chosen not to crumble. "I'm not here to cause problem," he said. I don't even know. I guess I wanted to acknowledge you, to say something, anything, even if it's late." Lulama studied him, her gaze scanning his expensive watch, tailored jacket, perfectly cut hair. "5 years is more than late," she said, and the words weren't cruel, only true. He nodded slowly, absorbing it, swallowing the shame that rose like smoke in his chest. "Can I buy you a coffee?" he asked after a pause, his voice quieter now. "Or tea? I'm not here for some dramatic scene. I just want half an hour. That's all." She tilted her head slightly, considering him the way a curator might assess a piece, checking for authenticity, for flaws, for meaning beneath the surface. Then to his surprise, she nodded. "There's a cafe next door. I can spare 30 minutes. They didn't speak as they exited the gallery and crossed the pavement to the cafe. The space was quiet, dimly lit with warm lamps, and smelled of cinnamon and honey. She ordered herbal tea. He asked for black coffee but didn't touch it. They sat by the window, the silence stretching between them, like a taut string neither dared pluck. "You look different," she said eventually, eyes not quite meeting his. "Success suits you." He laughed softly, without humor. "You look strong, happier." She smiled again, faintly. "I am." Her hand moved unconsciously to her belly. "She's due in 3 months." Leonard blinked. "She?" Lulama nodded. "A daughter." For a moment his heart paused mid-beat. In another life, that daughter might have been theirs. "And the father?" he asked carefully. Her answer was calm without hesitation. "There isn't one, not in the traditional sense. I used a donor." He stared at her, trying to mask the mixture of awe and guilt flooding him. "That's brave," and he murmured. She met his gaze squarely now. "It's what's right for me." Leonard looked down, his thumb tracing the rim of his cup. "I owe you more than just an apology," he said. "I owe you an explanation, or at least the truth." Lulama leaned back slightly. Then say it. Whatever you came here to say. He met her eyes, the words rising from someplace deeper than apology. I was a coward. I told myself leaving was a kindness, that you deserve better than a man drowning in debt and desperation. But the truth is, I didn't think I was enough, and I ran. She didn't respond at once, just looked at him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she said, "You're not the same man who walked out that night. I can see that." Then with a glance at her watch, she added, "But growth doesn't erase the damage. It just shows that it wasn't the end of the story." And somehow that was more grace than he had expected. As they rose to leave, Leonard felt a subtle shift, like the weight he'd carried for years had cracked just enough to let air in. No forgiveness. Not yet. No promises. But a beginning. And in the quiet space of that cafe, 30 minutes had rewritten 5 years of silence. The cafe's hum faded into a gentle background rhythm, the low clatter of cups behind the counter, the hiss of steam from the espresso machine, and the occasional soft conversation from nearby tables. But at their window seat, time moved differently. Outside, the light had shifted to gold, catching on the edges of Lulama's face as she watched Leonard across the small table, her fingers gently circling the base of her teacup. There was a quiet stillness about her, not the silence of tension, but of someone who had learned to live in her center. Leonard, meanwhile, sat forward slightly, elbows on the edge of the table, as if bracing himself for truths he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. He hadn't expected her to agree to this coffee, and now that they were here, he realized he hadn't truly prepared for what it meant to sit across from her, to face the version of Lulama who had grown stronger in his absence. There was no bitterness in her eyes, no resentment in her posture, just a calm detachment, like a woman who had made peace with the chaos life had thrown at her and moved on without needing an audience. "I meant what I said earlier," he started, his voice low but steady. "You're different now, in a good way. I guess I just—" He paused, searching for the right phrasing. "I didn't expect to see you this at peace." Lulama gave a soft nod, neither flattered nor offended. "That's because you remember me from a time when I was still trying to carry both of us. I was burning out, Leonard, but I didn't know it then." He looked at her, startled by the frankness of her words. "You always seemed so strong," he said. "You held everything together when I couldn't." She smiled slightly, a trace of something wry in the corners of her lips. "I was strong, yes, but strength can become survival if it isn't shared, and you weren't there to share it." Leonard dropped his gaze, her words cutting deeper, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. There was no accusation in her tone, just clarity. "I told myself I was leaving to protect you," he said quietly, "that I was doing the noble thing by stepping aside so you could have a better life." Lulama's eyes flicked toward the window. "You left to protect yourself from the shame of failure. Let's not twist that into something romantic." Her tone wasn't harsh, but it held steel, and Leonard felt his breath catch. He deserved that. All of it. Still, she didn't linger there. Her gaze returned to his, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentler. "But you were right about one thing," she said. "I did end up with a better life, just not the kind either of us imagined." He blinked, unsure what to say. "You're raising a child on your own," he said after a moment. "That can't be easy." She gave a soft laugh, not dismissive but genuine. "Nothing about life is easy, but I made the choice, on my terms. That's what makes all the difference." He tilted his head slightly. "You didn't want to wait for the right partner?" She met his eyes without hesitation. "I stopped believing that partnership should be a prerequisite for motherhood. I didn't want to gamble my future on someone else's readiness. I wanted to be a mother, not someday, not if things align, but because it was something deeply rooted in me. I didn't need someone to complete that picture. I just needed to be brave enough to draw it differently." There was something in her voice, fierce yet vulnerable, that made Leonard feel like the mirror around them had sharpened. He looked at her with something between admiration and quiet grief. "You've become the person I always knew you could be," he said, "the person I wasn't strong enough to stand beside." Lulame nodded once, as if acknowledging something already accepted. "We both made choices, Leonard, some out of fear, others out of freedom. This baby, this life I've built, it came from freedom, not fear. He felt that line settle into his chest with finality. This wasn't just about her pregnancy or his regrets. It was about the deep divergence of their journeys, hers defined by forward motion, his by looking over his shoulder. "Do you ever think about the life we almost had?" he asked, not with longing but curiosity. She considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not as a dream, more like a blueprint that no longer fits the structure I'm building now. I've outgrown it, and I'm okay with that." Leonard absorbed that, watching the light catch on the surface of her tea. "And me? Have you outgrown me too?" The question surprised even him, but once it was out, it lingered in the air like smoke. Lulama didn't flinch. "You're part of a chapter that shaped me," she said, "but I'm not defined by your exit or your return. The version of you I loved. He left, and I mourned him. What's left now is respect and curiosity. But love? That's not something I carry like an open wound anymore." He leaned back, breath shallow, feeling both the weight of loss and the strange comfort of truth. "I deserve that," he said quietly. "You don't owe me forgiveness." She shook her head slowly. "I'm not here to punish you. Life already did what it needed to. But I do hope you forgive yourself. You've spent so long running from your past, Leonard. Maybe now it's time you live inside your present." The server returned to clear their cups. Offering a polite smile, neither of them returned. Outside, the sun had slipped behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Lulama rose first, adjusting her coat over her shoulders, and Leonard stood with her, unsure if he should say more or simply let her go. But before she turned to leave, she looked at him one final time. "You asked for 30 minutes, she said softly. "You got them, and maybe that's enough for now." Then she walked out, her silhouette strong against the glow of the fading day, leaving Leonard standing by the window with nothing but his reflection and the echo of a woman who had finally chosen herself. The boardroom was quieter than usual, though the air still carried the sterile chill of polished ambition and filtered air. Leonard sat at the head of the table, suit jacket folded over the back of his chair, sleeves rolled up as though effort alone could anchor him back into the man he had spent years becoming. Across the long table, digital projections flashed quarterly earnings, bar graphs and sales targets, but he barely registered them. The voices around him were muted, muffled by the echo of Lulama's words, the clarity with which she had chosen herself, the finality in her tone that had somehow unraveled the momentum of his entire world. He should have cared about the numbers. A year ago, he would have argued over a decimal, demanded sharper projections, pressed his CFO on regional expansions. But now, as the senior director finished his presentation with the usual flourish of optimism, Leonard simply nodded without comment, as if the fate of a multi-million-dollar quarter were a footnote to a life he was no longer reading. Someone asked a question about restructuring. Someone else proposed a partnership deal in Berlin. Leonard offered a polite but empty smile, the kind that bought him minutes of silence before someone demanded his real opinion. After the meeting, he didn't return to his office. He bypassed the assistant with the crisp schedule, ignored the blinking phone with its waiting voicemails, and stepped into the elevator without destination or explanation. The mirrored walls reflected a man he barely recognized, a man polished to perfection, dressed in success, and hollowed out by something he hadn't even realized he'd lost. As the doors closed, he reached up, loosened his tie, and felt the fabric fall limp against his chest like the weight of a role he no longer wished to perform. By the time he reached the street, the city had changed. It hadn't physically altered, of course. The skyline still stabbed upward with glass and steel. The sidewalks pulsed with urgency. The taxis honked with the same impatient rhythm. But something within him no longer moved at that pace. He hailed a cab not toward his penthouse or his office, but to the outer edge of the city, toward the neighborhood where his memories lived, where time had once passed more slowly, where his hunger had been real and raw and simple. The streets were narrower here, uneven with patches of grass growing through cracked sidewalks. The buildings bore the wear of years without apology, and the corner bodega still leaned slightly to the left, as if time had nudged it over and left it that way. Leonard stepped out of the cab, walked down the block with something like reverence, and stopped in front of the faded red brick walk-up he hadn't seen since the night he packed a single suitcase and walked away from the life that had once meant everything. The apartment building hadn't changed much. Still old, still tired. But standing before it, Leonard felt the ghost stir. He remembered how the radiator hissed at night, how the windows whistled when the wind blew, how Lulama used to hum softly as she painted on the kitchen table, sleeves rolled up, hair tied high, eyes lost in creation. He remembered the small arguments, the shared ramen dinners, the kisses that tasted like hope. Most of all, he remembered who he had been before the world convinced him he had to be more. He didn't go inside. He didn't need to. The past wasn't waiting in the hallway or the chipped stairs. It was here, inside him, louder than it had been in years. He stood there until the cold began to creep through his shirt, and then he turned and walked. Not aimlessly at all. That night, he sent the email to his executive team. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't dramatic. Just a clean break. He was stepping away indefinitely. No timeline, no promises. They would survive without him. If they couldn't, then he had built something far more fragile than he ever intended. The out-of-office reply went up before dawn. The world would spin without Leonard Whitmore at its center. 2 days later, he stood in a different building, low-ceilinged, underfunded, warm with noise and activity. The community center smelled like old books, crayons, and floor cleaner. Children laughed in the next room, running through some kind of art class while a volunteer handed out snacks. Leonard signed in at the front desk with an unsteady hand and a quiet voice. He told the program director he wasn't here to lead, only to help. Sweep floors, clean brushes, set up chairs, and read books if someone needed reading. Whatever they had room for, he'd do it. At first, they didn't quite know what to make of him. A man in Italian leather shoes, used to corner offices and chauffeured cars, didn't exactly blend into the rhythm of glue sticks and graham crackers. But Leonard adapted. He learned quickly. He traded his designer wristwatch for a second-hand hoodie. He carried paint buckets without flinching and knelt on sticky linoleum floors to help a 6-year-old color inside the lines. No one here cared who he was before, and for the first time in years, he didn't care either. He slept lighter, but more soundly, ate less, but tasted more, walked more, thought slower, felt deeper. There was a sense of stillness he hadn't realized he needed until it wrapped itself around his mornings. Sometimes late at night, he'd find himself sketching memories in an old notebook. A hallway light, the shape of Lulama's laugh, the way her hand moved over her belly in the cafe. Not out of regret, but reflection. He didn't know what the next step would be. He wasn't planning a grand gesture or some sweeping return to her life, but he knew he couldn't keep living forward while dragging the weight of a man who never looked back. So he returned to where it all began, not to reclaim it, but to understand it. And in doing so, he began, for the first time, to feel like someone worthy of something more than an apology. Someone who could meet the future with open hands. Someone, perhaps, who was no longer afraid of becoming whole. The rain came without warning, sudden, harsh, drumming against the gallery's windows like a restless demand. Inside, Lulama stood with one hand braced against the reception desk, the other curled protectively around her belly. Her face was pale, lips pressed tightly together, but it was the flicker of panic in her eyes that alarmed the young assistant more than anything else. She'd been curating a new installation when the discomfort began, sharp and low, radiating from her spine down to her legs like a wave unraveling beneath the surface. At first, she'd brushed it off. Braxton Hicks, probably. Just another false alarm. But now, standing still, her vision slightly blurred. She wasn't so sure. "Should I call someone?" the assistant asked, voice cracking. Lulama nodded slowly, her words catching between shallow breaths. "My doctor, and Leonard. Call Leonard." It surprised her, the instinct to say his name. She hadn't planned to, but as the pain intensified, as the walls of calm professionalism collapsed beneath her, his name came like a reflex. Not out of dependence, but out of something older, something deeper. He had once been the person she trusted most, and part of her, quiet, buried, unresolved, still believed he would come. When the call reached him, Leonard was at the community center, seated cross-legged on the floor, reading a book about dragons to a circle of enthralled children. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and for a moment he considered ignoring it. But something, the urgency in the air, the invisible string that still tied him to a life he wasn't sure he'd left behind, made him answer. The assistant's voice was rushed, her words spilling over one another. Lulama, pain, hospital, early labor, alone. He didn't think. He moved. He apologized to the kids, handed the book to another volunteer, and was out the door before the children had even processed his absence. The drive to the hospital blurred past in streaks of red lights and wet pavement. His hands gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him tethered, his mind replaying every word she'd said in that cafe, every image of her face from their brief reconnection, every beat of silence he'd left unspoken between them. He wasn't the father. He wasn't even invited. But none of that mattered now. By the time he reached the maternity ward, Lulama had already been admitted. A nurse at the desk recognized his name and gestured toward a private room down the hall. When he stepped inside, the world seemed to narrow around her. She was lying back against a mountain of pillows, her hospital gown slightly askew, sweat clinging to her temples, her breathing shallow but measured. Despite the wires and machines, she looked strong. Exhausted, yes, but intact. Still her. She turned her head slowly, eyes finding his, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then through a labored breath, she whispered, "You came." He moved to her side without hesitation, pulling the chair close and taking her hand in both of his. "Of course I did," he said, his voice low, raw. "You called me." She gave a small nod, her grip tightening as another wave of pain rolled through her. He watched her ride it out without complaint, her strength astonishing, even in this vulnerable state. "It's too early," she said once the contraction passed. "They're trying to stop it. The baby isn't ready yet." Leonard looked into her eyes and saw it there. Not fear exactly, but the tension of a woman who had fought too hard to let go now. "You're not alone," he said. "Not anymore." They stayed like that for hours. Doctors came and went, machines beeped, nurses adjusted IV lines and monitored vitals. Leonard remained at her side, holding her hand, fetching water, pressing cool cloths to her forehead. At one point she drifted into a shallow sleep, and he just sat there, watching the rise and fall of her breath, feeling time slow around them in a way that made everything outside that room seem unreal. It wasn't romantic, and it wasn't dramatic. It was real, raw, and fiercely intimate in the way only crisis could create. When she woke again, it was after midnight, and the storm had finally passed. The contractions had slowed. The medication had worked. The baby, tiny, stubborn, and not quite ready for the world, had calmed. Leonard exhaled the breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Lulama turned her head toward him, her expression softening. "You didn't have to stay," she murmured. He shook his head. "Yes, I did." For a while they sat in silence, not needing to fill it. Then she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "I didn't expect this to mean anything," she said, "but it does." He looked at her, eyes heavy with exhaustion and something more fragile. "I meant what I said before," he replied. "I don't want to be forgiven out of pity, but I don't want to disappear again either." She reached out then, not to grip, not to plead, but to rest her hand over his where it lay on the edge of the bed. "I don't know what this is," she admitted, "but I know how it feels. Safe, familiar, uncomplicated, even in its complications." Leonard smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "Maybe that's enough for now." The nurse returned, checking vitals and nodding at the positive signs. Lulama would be staying for observation, but the crisis had passed. As the nurse left again, Leonard stood and adjusted the blanket at her shoulders. "I'm going to be right here," he said. "You sleep. I'll watch the storm from here." And she did. Not because she needed protection, but because, for the first time in a long time, she allowed someone to share the weight. As she drifted back to sleep, Leonard sat beside her, watching the steady rhythm of her breathing, the monitors blinking in quiet intervals, and the first light of dawn breaking through the hospital window. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight he had stayed, and that was the beginning. The baby didn't come early, not yet, but the scare had shifted something neither of them could name. After that night in the hospital, a quiet rhythm began to build between Leonard and Lulama, like a new song they were both learning by ear. It wasn't spoken aloud, and there were no declarations of intent, no sweeping promises, only small gestures carried out in the spaces between their separate lives. Leonard began showing up more, not uninvited, not expected, but welcome. At first, he would bring groceries when she was too tired to shop, or drive her to appointments when the city buses felt too slow. He never stayed unless asked. He never assumed anything, but he was there. They talked more in those days, softly, cautiously, like explorers crossing newly thawed ice. Conversations that once felt impossible now unfolded over kitchen counters and walks to the market. He would ask about the baby's name, her preferences for paint colors, and how she envisioned the nursery, and she would answer without flinching. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began imagining futures that involved each other, not as a couple reborn, but as two people rediscovering who they were outside of the pain they once shared. One afternoon after a checkup at the clinic, Lulama asked him to drive her to an address in a quiet residential district on the edge of the city. It was a modest neighborhood, full of tall oaks and well-worn sidewalks, with birdsong in the distance and laundry lines strung between porches. Leonard parked the car and followed her toward a single-story brick home with chipped shutters and a for sale sign leaning tiredly in the yard. She paused at the gate, one hand resting lightly on her stomach. "It's not much," she said, almost to herself, "but it has a backyard, and light, and quiet. I can see her here." Leonard didn't speak right away. He looked at the house, its uneven steps, its aging roof, the way the wild vines curled up the fence like it was clinging to life, and he saw what she saw, not flaws, possibility. "Let's go inside," he said. The realtor was late, so they stood in the driveway, talking about nothing and everything. When they finally entered, the house smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The floors creaked under their feet, and the walls bore the stains of time. But the windows caught the sunlight in a way that made the shadows feel less heavy. Lulama moved slowly from room to room, imagining how her daughter's cries might echo down the hallway, where the crib might stand, where art would hang again. Leonard followed silently, his heart pacing itself to the sound of her steps, knowing this moment wasn't his, but hoping cautiously that he might be allowed to belong to it. She didn't ask him outright, but days later, when the offer was accepted, she let him help with the paperwork. He didn't push. He simply said, "Whatever you need," and meant it. He bought the first chair for the front porch, an old rocking chair from a vintage store she had admired once in passing, and left it on the steps with a note, "In case she wants to be sung to sleep under the stars." She didn't call to say thank you, but a photo of the chair, softly captioned with a single heart emoji, arrived in his inbox that evening. As moving day approached, he took time off from volunteering and work altogether. The community center understood, perhaps better than he did. He spent the mornings lifting boxes, assembling furniture, fixing hinges, and repainting trim. Lulama's belly had grown larger now, round and luminous, and her movements were slower, but she still insisted on unpacking books herself, arranging them by author and theme in a shelf near the kitchen. When Leonard offered to help, she smiled and said, "Some things need to be done with care." He understood. It wasn't about the books. It was about ownership, about creating something that was truly hers. One morning, after a long stretch of hammering together the crib, Leonard stood in the backyard, wiping sweat from his forehead with a rag. Lulama joined him, carrying 2 glasses of cold water. They sat together beneath a tree, wide-branched, old and tangled, with dappled sunlight falling across their feet. The silence stretched between them, not awkward, but weighty. "This feels real now," she said. "The house, the quiet, her." He nodded. "It is real." She turned to him, the curve of her belly casting a shadow between them. "You've changed," she said softly. "Not just your job, or your clothes, or your schedule. Something deeper." Leonard looked at her, unsure whether to respond or simply let the words land where they were meant to. "I had to," he said. "The man I was couldn't have built this, couldn't have stood still long enough to see it. Then almost tentatively, she added, "If I asked, would you want your name on the birth certificate?" The question startled him, not because he didn't want it, but because she asked. It wasn't a test. It wasn't a gift. It was an invitation to show up, to be counted, to commit not just to her, but to the child who would carry a story neither of them could fully predict. He didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said, "if you'll allow it." They sat in the stillness that followed, the wind shifting the branches above their heads. Something had settled between them. Not resolution, not romantic closure, but the scaffolding of something enduring. That night, they moved the last box inside, and as Lulama stood at the front door, key in hand, Leonard placed his palm gently over hers. "This is home," he whispered. They didn't kiss. They didn't speak of love. But when the porch light blinked on and their shadows stretched side by side across the hallway floor, neither one of them stepped away. In that house, under that tree, and with that child soon to come, they had found something even stronger than reconciliation: hope. And this time, it had a front door, a rocking chair, and a name waiting to be spoken. The birth came quietly, not in the chaos of emergency or panic, but in the still, sacred hours before dawn. The world outside the hospital window was dark, the city not yet stirring, as if it too held its breath for her arrival. Lulama's face was damp with sweat, her fingers gripping the edge of the bed, her breath coming in steady waves. Leonard stood beside her, a damp cloth in one hand, his other clutching hers tightly, their grips mirrored intention and trust. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say that wouldn't dissolve in the magnitude of the moment. The silence between them was filled only with the hum of monitors and the steady encouragement of nurses whose hands moved like rituals passed down through generations. When the baby finally arrived, there were no theatrics, just a long exhale, a cry, sharp and clear like a trumpet cutting through fog, and then the weight of her was laid gently on Lulama's chest. The child's skin was flushed, her fists curled tight, her hair a soft halo of dark curls. Lulama held her as if she had always known her body curling instinctively around the tiny form. Leonard looked on, eyes stinging not with fear or doubt, but with the strange, overwhelming wonder of bearing witness to something whole and new. A nurse leaned in and asked for the baby's name. Lulama didn't look away from the child, but her voice was sure when she said, "Her name is Hope." Leonard closed his eyes briefly, as if to hold the word inside him longer. When he opened them, Lulama was looking at him, not for approval, not for validation, but with a kind of shared understanding. Hope was not just a name. It was the thread that had pulled them back from the edges of their separate lives, the silent reason they had both shown up when it mattered most. In the days that followed, the hospital room transformed into a cocoon. Nurses came and went, doctors checked vitals, paperwork was filed, but inside that small, sunlit room, a quiet intimacy grew. Leonard stayed, not because he was asked to, but because there was nowhere else he wanted to be. He changed diapers with clumsy fingers and rocked Hope in the blue chair he had assembled by hand. Lulama watched him not with suspicion, but with a curiosity that slowly softened into trust. When she slept, he held the baby and whispered stories he hadn't told anyone in years. About the father he never really knew, about the time he almost gave up, about the moment he saw her again and felt time collapse into something eternal. One afternoon, as he filled out the birth certificate, pen in hand, he hesitated only for a second before writing his name beside hers. There was no legal obligation, no pressure, only choice, and he made it without ceremony, the way a man steps into a room he already belongs to. Lulama watched from her bed, saying nothing, but when their eyes met, something quiet passed between them. Not forgiveness, not even certainty, but a shared willingness to let the past be only one chapter in a much longer book. Weeks passed. The seasons shifted. The air grew warmer, and the new house began to settle around them like a second skin. Lulama painted again, small canvases at first, quiet, maternal scenes with bold textures and layered meaning. Leonard worked part-time at the center, spending mornings organizing art classes for the kids and afternoons fixing things around the house. They fell into a rhythm that didn't require labels. Some nights they shared dinner, other nights silence. He knew when to give her space and when to hold the baby so she could breathe. She knew when to ask him to stay and when to let him find his way in solitude. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of tension, ghosts that crept in through cracked windows, reminders of promises once broken. But those moments came less often, and when they didn't linger. Instead of wounds, they became weathered seams, proof that something had been mended rather than replaced. One evening, they stood beneath a wide tree in the backyard, Hope asleep inside, the monitor faintly glowing on the porch. The wind moved through the branches with a sound like breath, and the moon cast soft silver patterns across the grass. Leonard took something from his pocket, a small velvet box. He didn't kneel, didn't make a speech. He simply opened it, revealing a modest gold band and a look in his eyes that said everything. Lulama stared at it for a long moment, not out of hesitation, but out of gravity. "I'm not the same woman you left," she said, "and I'm not here to rescue you from your past." He smiled, voice steady. "I'm not asking you to save me. I'm asking if I can walk beside you now, as the man who stayed." She looked at him then, not through the lens of what they were, but who they had become, and slowly she nodded. Then yes. They married beneath that tree, just them, the baby in her arms, and a handful of friends from the gallery and the community center. There were no vows read from paper, no music beyond birdsong, and the occasional laughter of a child. Just a quiet ceremony marked by soft eyes, held hands, and the shared belief that love, when reimagined, could be even stronger than love unbroken. Later that night, Leonard rocked Hope on the porch while Lulama painted by lamplight. Inside the house, their life bloomed slowly, not as a return, but as a rebirth. And in that stillness, wrapped in the hum of possibility, they were not two people who had simply found each other again. They were a family, a home, a full circle. And for the first time in a very long time, everything felt like it had arrived exactly where it was meant to be. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of love, loss, and rediscovery. If this story touched you in any way, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Share what moved you most in the comments below. Your voice matters here. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a new story, and let us know where in the world you're listening from. Until next time, take care, stay inspired, and keep believing in second chances.